Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Eimear.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah. And can I just compliment yourself and Rose and the team behind it? Pulling together this kind of conference in so few weeks is incredible and well done. And I remind everyone to donate to those great causes as well if you're enjoying the conference. So in a complete and utter change in tone, I am going to bring you right back down to the rocks. I am a geologist at the British Geological Survey here in Edinburgh, and I'd like to talk to you a bit more about some of the what I call metal budgets and alternative resources. And I've called it waste not, want not, because I think there's a lot of potential in these resources that we are in fact missing. Another name for this talk could in fact be getting more metal out of less rock, as we discussed quite extensively on Monday in those sessions. So why do we care? Well, in fact, there are two quite important sustainable development, UN sustainable development goals that I think are quite important when we think about mining and exploitation of resources. And those are, of course, responsible consumption and production. And I'd also include decent work and economic growth, because I think we discussed earlier in the week that mining actually accounts for something like, I think it was 45% of GDP. So actually mining is a really important part of our economy, and that needs to be considered when we are talking about these sort of resources. But of course, our overall goal really is to achieve a more sustainable minerals economy. So I want to bring your attention to the World Bank Minerals for Climate Action Report, which was released earlier this week, and I know there's a link to it on the web pages. And it discusses quite a lot of the major metals, and of that, aluminium is discussed quite extensively. And it explains that there will be a 9% increase in demand by 2050. And while it focuses on those major metals, it also discusses the minor metals, dysprosium, which is a rare earth element, and gallium. Now, these are actually, I have a little star here to remind me that to explain that these are critical metals. And hopefully you heard some of the talks earlier the week and Catherine's talk yesterday. But these essentially are metals that are at risk of supply interruption and are very economically important. So I think what's important is that, you know, the rare earths have been recognized as critical for 9 years now by the earliest BGS risk list, and gallium has been definitely recognized as critical by the European Commission work as early as 2014. And if we're saying that, you know, these are going to be critical in the future, can you imagine what kind of resources we need to develop in order to meet this demand in the future? So where do we get these elements from? Well, aluminium, our main ore is bauxite. And if you heard from Catherine's talk yesterday, the rare earths typically come from carbonatite, alkali igneous rocks, and some alternative resources, which I am going to discuss. And gallium, 90% of gallium actually comes from bauxite, and 10% from zinc ore, where it's extracted, where it's incorporated, into sphalerite. But if I could bring your attention now to bauxite, which is obviously what I'm going to talk about here. So this base map is from our colleagues at the USGS, Schulte and Foley, from 2013, and it's a really, really nice review of gallium in bauxite resources, and I highly recommend you download that, which is freely available. And the statistical data is from the BGS, some work that we do every year, and it's recently released, and that's world mineral production. So last year we produced in 2018, we produced 326 million tons of bauxite, and this is what we use for our aluminium resources. Now you can actually see that bauxite isn't too badly spread. So 30% comes from Australia, 19% comes from China, 18% comes from Guinea, 10% from Brazil, 7% from India, and the remaining 1% comes from across the world. And we extract this bauxite from both karst bauxites and lateritic bauxites. And so karst bauxites are those that form on a karst carbonate surface, and lateritic bauxites are those that form more in situ. And I'm going to focus now really on the karst bauxites and the potential resources that are potential resources of rare earths that are there. So here on the left-hand side of your screen, there is an image of a bauxite that we visited in Turkey. And the rare earths they really suffer from being called rare earths because it's a complete and utter oxymoron. They are by no means rare. In fact, if you look at some SEM images here from this bauxite, you can see that there's XTM is xenotime, and that's a phosphate that contains rare earths. And this is probably a detrital rare earth bearing phase. It's likely that this actually was incorporated in the original formation of the bauxite. And then we have these fluorocarbonate group minerals, such as bastnasite, parisite, sinchasite, those type of minerals. And you can see it's actually, this is what we call an orthogenic mineral. So this actually formed as the bauxite was forming. It's not a detrital one that got incorporated. And then we also have minerals such as cerianite, which is a cerium oxide. Now, cerium behaves a bit differently to the other rare earths in these bauxites, but you can see that it's hosted here. If I use my mouse, yeah, that works. You can see that it is hosted along what we call fractures, and you can see it's coating fracture surfaces here. And this tells us quite a bit about the mobility of rare earths. They are mobile within these bauxites, and that's quite important because actually, if you look at the base of these bauxites where they're hosted in these cracks or the contact zones, where you have perhaps bits of limestone incorporated into your bauxite, it actually creates a geochemical barrier. So within this bauxite, you can see all this very bright white stuff is actually fluorocarbonates. And these are forming because there's essentially a barrier between the conditions you have here in the bauxite and the conditions you have here, the geochemical conditions you have here in the carbonate. So I think what's very interesting is that there are rare earth bearing phases forming, primary rare earth minerals forming within this bauxite. Now, when we're actually processing our bauxite, we use typically most people use a process called the Bayer process, and that's used to produce alumina from bauxite. And the waste product of this is red mud. Now, for every 1 ton of bauxite you process, you get 1.5 tons of red mud. And you can see here, this is what it looks like, enormous ponds of red mud. And I know we've had a lot of discussions about tailings, and there are enormous discussions we could have about the risks of red mud tailings in particular, but that's perhaps not for this talk. But these typically contain about 1,000 ppm, and there appears to be some sort of upgrading, presumably as rare earths are released, as the bauxite is processed, upgrade of about 100%. So it basically doubles in content as you end up in these as the rare earths end up in the red mud. And why this is important is actually that there's an awful lot of work has gone into actually potentially extracting the rare earths from these red muds. And this was a lot of work that was done during the EU Rare project, and particularly in that project, the ionic liquids were used as a potential extractive method to get the rare earths out of the red muds. And you can see that so there's definitely work that was earlier than 2013, but even just in the last 7 years, there's an awful lot of work that has been done using ionic liquids, acid leaching, bioleaching, and this is mostly focused on the red muds. But I draw your attention to this Barnett et al. Paper, which is in PrEP, which I've been involved with, where they are looking at, they're comparing different methods of bioleaching of the actual bauxite. So I think that although we haven't quite got to the point where we've developed we've got lab scale processing, but we haven't quite got to pilot scale processing of red muds. But just to bring to your attention that there is huge potential within these sort of deposits for alternative resources of things like rare earths, where we are really looking to diversify our supply. And so if I completely change and flick right over to gallium production, this here is just some data from our data download tool from the BGS. If you look at, so there are only 3 countries in 2018 that actually produce gallium. Now, China produces 96% of gallium, but they only produce 19% of global bauxite. And the industry estimates, some data suggests that currently only 10% of alumina producers actually extract gallium. Now, this to me is well, it's 2 things, because obviously you have to consider what the demand for gallium is. But also, if you look to the future and this report from the World Bank, that gallium is in fact going to potentially be very important for those photovoltaic cells. And as we decarbonize, the demand for those sort of cells is going to go up. So we need to really consider what our future production is going to look like. And where are we actually going to get that gallium from? So if we look at some of the countries that are what we potentially call developing countries, places like Guinea, they actually produce 18%, so equivalent amount essentially to China's production. However, there are very few data that exist. So this enormous compilation from Schulte and Foley, actually, they didn't find any data for gallium content in these type of deposits. And I think that is potentially a very big gap in the literature and in our knowledge, because if there's potential to get extra economic value, which in fact we know there will be a demand for in the future, that this is a really important gap that we need to address. And if you look at the rare earth data, I've talked a lot about these karst bauxites, but there's an awful lot of lateritic bauxites in this part of the world. From what I can find, there is almost no rare earth data. Now, obviously, these laterites are forming in situ, so there will be an awful lot of host rock control on what those rare earths, what the rare content will be, but we really don't have a real grasp of what that looks like. And so I think that in order that if we are really trying to address the responsible consumption and production and address these future demands, we really need to have that level of information in terms of what this rare earth content is, how they behave within these different type of bauxites, and what is that gallium content, and could they use that to actually increase the value of the bauxite that they're producing. So I think that really, in order to achieve this more sustainable minerals economy, we need to addressing these demands for these minerals that are necessary for climate action and decarbonization, that there's some real scientific gaps in the literature. And hopefully BGS, we're going to try and keep addressing it. We obviously did quite a lot of work through EU Rare, and we're hoping to continue that work. So I'd love to hear from anyone who's interested in getting involved in that. So please do get in touch. I think with that, I'm going to leave it there. I think I've run out of time. Cheers. Thank you very much.